Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what time zone you're in. My name is Courtney Tate, and I work at Eli Lilly and Company. And I was able to join the 2019 iCAN Summit in Kansas City. And then I was able to join the virtual summit last year as well. So my background, I have a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology. And I'm in our pediatric group where I support and advise teams on pediatric research and drug development across our company. And then I am also the liaison to iCAN. And so whenever we have a team or group that is wanting to get youth feedback, I work with iCAN in order to facilitate that interaction. So ground rules for today, you can stop participating at any time, and then please use the chat function to enter any questions or comments, and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. Unfortunately, this year we didn't have a project where we needed input at this time, but we hope to bring some exciting projects to iCAN by the end of the year for input. So instead, I wanted to touch on some of our COVID-19 research, our diversity and inclusion efforts, our patient-focused drug development efforts, and then at the end, this is a continuous dialogue between Lilly and iCAN on, where can we collaborate and more effectively? Where can we utilize iCAN better? We've had some projects in the past, but looking forward, where can we involve iCAN and do some innovative, different things. So as I mentioned, I work at Eli Lilly and Company. Eli Lilly is a large pharmaceutical company. This picture is the headquarters, which is based in Indianapolis, Indiana. However, we have employees around the globe, and our purpose is Lilly Unites Caring with Discovery to make lives better for people around the world. So we're a global company. We're heavily involved in drug development and research in multiple therapeutic areas, including oncology, diabetes, immunology, pain, and we're starting to get into novel therapies, as I'll talk about with COVID, and then starting to get into gene therapy and new modalities as well. So I think at this point, everyone is very familiar with COVID-19, the viral respiratory infection caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And we know that COVID-19 affects people of all ages. And so in contrast to adults, most infected children appear to have a milder course, including asymptomatic infections and better outcomes overall compared to adults, especially older adults. The symptoms are similar in children and adults, but the frequency of those symptoms varies. So as the pandemic started unfolding, those of us that support pediatric research started to think about, how are we going to approach treatments and prevention in the pediatric population. At Lilly, we weren't a company that traditionally focused on anti-infectives. It's been decades since we've had an anti-infective program. However, we were trying to find any of our existing therapies to see if they could have an effect against COVID. So at Lilly, we were trying to focus on novel therapies as well for treatment and prevention of COVID-19. So for the pediatric space, we sponsored a webinar back in May of 2020 with one of our partners. So IACT is called Institute for Advanced Clinical Trials for Children. Basically, we had IACT bring all the key stakeholders together. So that was industry, clinicians, so the ones that were seeing MISC in the hospitals and treating the severe COVID-19 patients, patient and advocacy groups, as well as the regulators. which included individuals from the FDA, to all come together and start the dialogue around, how are we going to approach drug development for COVID-19 in children. And from that workshop, it was clear that FDA was going to push for, novel treatments for children in the COVID-19 space. And so we had to start thinking about all of our adult programs that were moving forward in COVID-19, how those applied to pediatrics, how we're going to bring them forward in clinical trials in children. So what we did at Lilly, we created a task force of cross-functional experts, and we also facilitated what's called an advisory board. So we bring in the experts in the clinical space around infectious diseases, and we get them all at the table. We present our molecule, the mechanism of action, kind of what we're thinking, and we get the expert feedback around our study, our clinical trial study design, our strategy, and kind of, what they think based on their expertise and knowledge of how we should develop these therapies in children. IACT also released a emergency access program to speed clinical trials for COVID-19 and a white paper regarding research priorities for the pediatric community during COVID-19 as well. So I wanted to talk about one of our novel treatments for COVID-19. At the beginning of the pandemic, in March of 2020, Lilly partnered with Accelera to develop these neutralizing antibody products for the prevention and treatment of SARS-CoV-2. So how did they do this? They took immune cells from one of the first US patients that had recovered from the virus and screened them. They identified these antibody sequences from the patient's natural immune response to the virus, and then developed these monoclonal antibodies that were very effective at neutralizing the virus in vitro and in non-clinical models, and they developed them for intravenous infusion in humans. So the neutralizing antibodies, the two I'm going to talk about today are bamlanivimab and etesevimab. They're recombinant neutralizing IgG monoclonal antibodies to the spike protein of the virus. And so SARS-CoV-2, how it enters the cells, the spike protein binds to the ACE2 receptor, and that allows entry of the virus into the cell, where it then takes over the machinery of the cell and replicates the virus. These neutralizing antibodies actually bind to different but overlapping epitopes in the receptor binding domain of the spike protein, and it basically blocks the attachment of that spike protein to the ACE2 receptor so that you inhibit the entry of the virus into the cell. And so when we started the COVID-19 development, things had changed. People were on lockdown. If you were COVID-19 positive, you weren't going out and going to the doctor. There was a lot of telehealth visits. And so we had to think about, like, how are we going to run these clinical trials during this pandemic? There was this kind of the whole scientific and medical community came together given the need and the fact that we had so many individuals that were having severe disease and dying, where it was like, we have to move as quickly as possible. These patients are waiting for novel therapies and options. And so a lot of our resources and priorities shifted to COVID-19 programs. And that happened across the board in industry. So obviously with the vaccine development, that became a priority for Moderna, J&J, Pfizer, and others. For us, we weren't a vaccine company, so we were focusing on prevention and treatment modalities outside of vaccines. And we saw that we needed a lot of speed in pivoting our strategy. And so originally our monoclonal antibodies we had one antibody that was being used to treat patients. We started in hospitalized patients. It didn't work. So we were catching the viral infection too late. We realized that we needed to intervene earlier to have an effect with the neutralizing antibodies. And as things were evolving, the variants also started popping up with the viruses. And so we introduced a second neutralizing antibody into the mix to help alleviate that concern of, the different variants and the monotherapy not being able to neutralize some of the different variants that were popping up. So the strategy was just constantly evolving, and usually it takes us years to do development, where this was condensed down into 6 months to a year, trying to get the strategy figured out, and the data we needed to take these novel therapies forward. We also utilize mobile healthcare, given that a lot of the patients and families wanted to stay at home. So we tried to do in-home nursing visits as much as possible, telemedicine visits when we could, for our ongoing clinical trials that weren't treating COVID-19, but were important because obviously we have clinical trials, as I mentioned, in oncology, diabetes, other therapeutic areas. We wanted to keep those clinical trials up and going. So we had to come up with new ways to deliver study drug to the patients, whether that be pickup or mailing it to their home. And then for the neutralizing antibodies, we actually did a significant amount of effort to do these mobile infusion centers. So it was I kind of envision it like you take an RV and you basically strip out the insides and make it into a mobile treatment medical center that has all the stuff that the nurses and the doctors need to do the infusion and monitor the patients. And so that way we had these mobile infusion centers where we could go to hotspots and where there were a lot of COVID-19 infections as a supplement to having certain individual sites for a clinical trial. So we could literally go where the infections and the need were. We also included adolescents and pregnant patients in our neutralizing antibody COVID-19 trials. The FDA has pushed in recent years to say, adolescents are very similar to adults as far as response to drugs and dosing, and we should be including adolescents when the disease is similar in adolescents and adults, and we expect the response to be similar in those populations as well. That way we get some information in the pediatric population as far as confirming dosing and some safety information in children faster. And then given that COVID affects certain minority populations more severely than others, we had a huge focus on increased diversity and inclusion in these clinical trials so that our clinical trial population was mimicking, the effect that we were seeing on the population as a whole. We also had this image on the right is we did a partnership with Lifeology where we created some patient-facing educational materials for younger kids and for older kids for understanding COVID-19 infection and clinical trials. So what did COVID-19 teach us? Basically, it's the importance of flexibility and how quickly things can evolve and change, and how we need to pivot our strategy to address that. And as I mentioned, we weren't a company that had focused in the past or the recent past on anti-infectives. So we really had to understand the different medical needs in this infectious disease space. We had to bring in the right experts, the right external individuals to help us think through and strategize on how we should be developing these novel therapies. It reinforced the need to plan and think about pediatrics early during the clinical development process. So as I mentioned, engaging those pediatric external experts for advice, and then the early dialogue with the FDA and EMA, so the regulators, so that we know kind of where the regulators are thinking, and there's no surprises if we propose a plan and then the regulators come back and have a completely different idea of how we need to develop the treatment. It's very hard to start a pediatric clinical trial if we're still uncertain on our adult strategy. And in the case of COVID, our adult strategy kept being modified and changed as we learned more information and got additional data. So it was very hard to figure out, what the clinical trial in children is going to look like until we knew kind of where do we have efficacy, or where does this thing work in adults, and kind of what are we bringing forward, whether that be, monotherapy for treatment, a combination of neutralizing antibodies for treatment, prevention, where we were going to take this thing forward in the adult space, because that then informs what the pediatric clinical trial needs to be. As always, in every research program, age-appropriate formulation considerations are critical. And so in the case of the neutralizing antibodies, we got kind of lucky. So the formulation that was developed for adults, which originally was a 1-hour IV infusion, worked in children. In some cases, we're not so lucky, where the adult formulation isn't appropriate for kids and we have to develop a new age-appropriate formulation. We also need to think about the safety of these investigational agents, and the benefit-risk discussion is very important and impacts the trial design and feasibility. And so in this case, since children tend to have less severe disease, we need to think about what data do we need in terms of safety and efficacy, and how well these novel agents and the vaccines work before we put them into children. So I always say it as, you have to pass the mom test, the mom and the parent test of convincing a parent of the benefit risk for any novel agent. And that's a difficult thing to do, especially when the impact of COVID-19, like I said, in children is less severe than adults. This is an IV infusion. You have to think about those safety concerns and other things before you can convince parents or caregivers to put their child on a clinical trial. So what have we learned that will help us for the next pandemic? Since these, like I said, these acute infections in children are less serious than adults, so that kind of fostered this approach to delay our pediatric studies. So we have proof of concept data in adults, which proof of concept means we have enough data to convince ourselves that it's efficacious, that it's worthwhile, that we are having an effect on the infection course of the virus. However, we don't know any potential long-term effects of COVID-19. We just haven't, gone far enough out from the pandemic. As we know with chickenpox, it can remain dormant for a long time, and then you can get shingles later on in life. So, we just don't know what these long-term effects of COVID-19 may be, if any. And traditionally, many infectious diseases have had a more severe impact on children. And so if you look at severity of the flu or other infectious diseases, it usually affects the youngest patient population the most and the elderly population the most. So COVID-19 was different. It affected that elderly population the most, but we weren't seeing, another detrimental effect on the smallest children. And so in the future, if we have an infectious disease that is, affecting that pediatric population more severely or just as severely as we saw in the elderly population, if we waited to bring forward clinical trials in children, that would delay the treatment for children and mean that we would have more deaths in that pediatric population. As I mentioned, overall, this is a very difficult, bioethical debate and discussion that, it will continue to evolve as we have more data. And it's a very complex issue. There's no right or wrong. And it's just something where we constantly have to consider the benefit risk to any novel therapy in children. And so we want to start thinking about, how do we achieve a better balance for pediatric patients in novel therapies. So switching gears from COVID-19, we have a huge project at Lilly to look at increasing diversity and inclusion in our clinical trials. So why is this needed? So we've seen that minority or marginalized communities are not as likely to participate in clinical trials. And this causes a health disparity because clinical trials can give patients the opportunity to participate in the development of new medicines. This low participation of these underrepresented populations has been a long-standing problem in our industry of drug development. So we are all trying to step up our efforts to really move the bar in this area. We want to make sure our medicines help a diverse patient base. And we must do a better job of reducing the barriers for enrollment of these underrepresented populations in our clinical trials. So I pulled another FDA guidance document on diversity and inclusion. As you can see, the regulators tend to put out a lot of guidance documents around their current thinking in certain spaces. And so this guidance document, I pulled out some interesting text that I wanted to point out where, it's saying that industry sponsors should enroll in patients who reflect the characteristics of clinically relevant populations with regard to age, sex, race, and ethnicity. So I thought it was very interesting that they included age as well as part of their diversity and inclusion efforts. And again, like the other guidance documents, they say, inclusion of children and adolescents in confirmatory, which is typically phase 3 clinical trials involving adults when appropriate, inclusion of racial and ethnic minorities, and analysis of clinical data by race and ethnicity, because these can differ based on many different factors. And then it also said, consider a broader pediatric development program early. So again, all these guidance documents are encouraging us to think and plan about pediatric development earlier on in the drug development process. I just wanted to point out our Lillys Diversity and Inclusion goals. The first one is to create a robust clinical trial strategy and reach diverse populations. So the goal is for each clinical trials participants to match the composition of the patient population that might use that medicine once it's approved. In order to do this, we have to start identifying and addressing the barriers that are keeping the underrepresented populations from participating in research. We're also looking at selecting a diverse range of trial sites and investigators, again, to match kind of the composition of the population in terms of gender and race and ethnicity. And then increasing diverse representation through partnerships and collaboration. So partnering with patients, advocacy groups, the regulatory agencies, healthcare professionals, all the key stakeholders to help identify and implement these solutions to increasing our diversity and inclusion. The FDA also has a whole website around patient-focused drug development. I wanted to point this out to iCAN because this highlights the importance of the work that iCAN is doing and bringing the youth patient voice into research. And so instead of one FDA guidance document, they actually have 4 FDA guidance documents on patient-focused drug development. So they have the whole series. There's this big push around, including the patient voice in everything that we do. I also wanted to point out last year, I worked with iCAN to write a blog around, why it's important to listen to the youth voice for patient-centric pediatric drug development. And this is, this speaks to why our partnership with iCAN is so important and how it's been fruitful over the years and how useful the input and feedback we get from the youth is. And then we've done tweet chats with iCAN, colab, which is basically we set aside 1 or 2 days to go through the protocol with all the key stakeholders, including the patients and the parents, the investigators, and we basically walk through the protocol and get feedback on all sections of the protocol around feasibility, any questions, any input we can get on what we could change in our protocol to make it easier to implement, or what might be hangups on the site side. So we've done plenty of collabs where we've had youth feedback on our pediatric clinical trials, blogs. We've done a lot of input and focus groups on our patient-facing materials, including our assent templates. We had a What is a Clinical Trial comic book for young and older kids that we did with Jumo. As I mentioned, we had pill swallowing training and this continuomics feedback on, continuous data monitoring and devices and clinical trials. And then in November, we had a really great opportunity to do a podcast where we had Kyan, Olivia, and Amy Omer join us. They did a fantastic job talking about their experience with type 1 diabetes and pediatric research. So that is available at anywhere you can find a podcast. And what we want to continue the dialogue with iCAN is, how can we collaborate better? What other projects should we be working on together? How could we include iCAN in our diversity and inclusion efforts? So we are very open to any ideas that the youth have, or anyone at iCAN on, how can we better utilize iCAN and achieve better outcomes together. Thank you for your time and attention today, and we're always welcome to any input or feedback that you have. So I'll stop there, and we can answer any questions or read the comments. So thank you.